The church doors slammed open. Every head turned. The whispers started before the echo even died. She was already standing at the altar, flowers in her trembling hands, when the messenger stumbled through the aisle and leaned into the groom's ear. Whatever he heard, it drained the color from his face. He stepped back. Then again. His eyes would not meet hers. And then, without a single word, without even the dignity of an apology, Lord Fenwick Drayle turned and walked away from the altar. He left her there, in front of everyone. Miss Aurelia Summers, daughter of a modest but respected family, a woman who had planned every detail of this day for 8 months. The flowers, the vows, the future she believed was finally within reach, all of it. Gone, in less than 30 seconds. The gasps rippled through the pews like a wave. Old ladies covered their mouths. Gentlemen looked away. Her mother gripped the edge of the bench, so hard her knuckles turned white. Her younger sister froze mid-breath. Aurelia didn't cry. She stood completely still, the way a person stands when the ground has just disappeared beneath their feet, and they have not yet begun to fall. That was when the silence broke in a different way. A figure rose from the left side of the church. Tall, composed, dark eyes that missed nothing. He had been seated near the back, almost like a man who had never intended to be noticed. But now every eye in that church found him, because he was walking forward, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had already made a decision before the rest of the room had processed what was happening. He stopped just short of the altar and looked directly at her. His voice was low, but the church was so silent that everyone heard every word. "If you will have me," said the Duke of Carver, "I will not walk away." Nobody breathed. "Now, before we go any further, tell me this. If the man you loved left you at the altar, and a duke stepped forward in front of everyone, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, because this community is growing, and we love seeing you here. And if this opening already has your heart racing, please hit the subscribe button. You do not want to miss what happens next. The church doors had not closed behind him yet when the whispers started. Lord Fenwick Drayle was gone, down the side corridor, through the servants' exit, out into the street without a single backward glance. And the woman he had left standing at the altar was still holding her flowers. Aurelia Summers did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing when the messenger had leaned into Fenwick's ear and everything had collapsed. The petals were pressing into her palm. The ribbon around the stems was cutting gently into her fingers. She could feel none of it. The numbness that comes before real pain had wrapped itself around her completely, and she was grateful for it, because the alternative was falling apart in front of 200 people, and she was not going to do that. Not here. Not for them. The church was absolutely silent for about 4 seconds. Then it broke open all at once. Gasps layered on top of gasps. The woman 3 rows back made a sound like she might faint. Fans started snapping open, or gentlemen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Children were shushed by mothers who were themselves too distracted to be effective. Aurelia's younger sister Constance, seated in the front row beside their mother Margaret, had gone the colour of chalk. Her father, Edmund, had risen halfway from his seat and seemed unsure whether to walk forward or stay still. Aurelia looked straight ahead. She was aware, in a detached and almost clinical way, that her life had just changed completely. Not only today, not only this ceremony and this dress and these flowers, but everything she had built in her mind over 3 years with Fenwick. The house she had pictured, the quieter mornings she had imagined, the sense of stability she had believed was finally coming. All of it was gone in the time it took a man to listen to a whispered message and decide that leaving was easier than staying. She exhaled through her nose. And then a figure stood up on the left side of the church. She noticed him because nobody else was standing. Everyone else was frozen or craning forward or covering their mouths. But this man rose slowly and deliberately, the way a person moves when they have already decided something and are simply carrying out the decision. He was tall, dark eyes, a stillness about him that was different from the stillness of shock. This was the stillness of intention. He walked forward down the side aisle. Slowly, every eye in the building found him. He stopped just before the altar steps and looked directly at her. His voice was low and even, and the church was quiet enough that every person present heard every syllable. "If you will have me," said the Duke of Carver, "I will not walk away." The silence that followed was enormous. Aurelia looked at him. She had met Caius Alderton exactly twice, once at a winter gathering 14 months ago, where she had noted him briefly from across a room as the private, unapproachable Duke that matchmaking mothers had been failing to engage for 4 consecutive seasons. Once at a spring luncheon, where they had spoken for perhaps 8 minutes about a novel they had both read, and he had said he had read it twice, and she had been mildly surprised by that. 2 meetings, less than 15 minutes of actual conversation, and here he was. Or she became aware that her answer was being waited for, with barely concealed desperation, by everyone present. She looked at him steadily. "You do not know me well enough to make that offer." "I know enough," he said. "That is a confident claim. I am a confident man." Someone near the back smothered a sound. The tension in the room shifted without breaking. Aurelia held his gaze for another moment. Then, quietly enough that only he could hear, she asked, "Why?" He did not hesitate. "Because what just happened to you was wrong, and because I am in a position to prevent what comes next." She understood exactly what he meant. She was not naive about the mechanics of her social world. A woman left at the altar was not simply embarrassed. She was marked. The invitations would stop. The eligible men would look elsewhere. Her family's already modest reputation would absorb damage they could not recover from easily. She had understood all of that within 30 seconds of Fenwick's disappearance, and it had settled in her chest like cold stone beneath the shock. The Duke was offering his name as a shield. But there was something in his eyes she could not entirely categorize as calculation. Something steadier and less readable than simple strategy. She thought about Fenwick's back as he walked through that door. She thought about her mother's face this morning at breakfast, bright and full of a happiness that now felt unbearable to remember. She thought about 3 years and what they had turned out to be worth. She lifted her chin. "Very well," she said. The church exploded. Her father's hat fell off when he stood. Her mother made a sound that was somewhere between devastation and sudden, desperate relief. Constance grabbed the pew in front of her with both hands. The guests became a single mass of overlapping voices and snapping fans and urgent whispered questions. The Duke stepped forward and offered his arm. She took it. It was completely steady beneath her hand, not performatively so. Just solid, the way something is solid when it has decided not to move. They walked out through the main entrance, not the side door, not the servants' exit, through the arch, past every face, under the full weight of every pair of eyes in that building, and out into the London sunlight. She did not cry. The Duke's carriage was at the bottom of the steps. The footman opened the door. She stepped in and sat and looked at her hands, still holding the flowers, because she had forgotten somehow to put them down. He sat across from her. The door closed. The crowd noise muffled and faded. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Aurelia said, "I do not know your given name." Caius, he said. Caius Alderton. Caius. She tried the shape of it. I am Aurelia Summers, though I imagine you knew that. I did. London moved past the window, ordinary and indifferent. I need to ask you something directly, she said. Ask. Did you plan this? He looked at her steadily. No, but I do not regret it. She studied his face for signs of deception and found nothing she could identify as such. Whether that meant honesty or exceptional control, she could not yet tell. What happens now? She asked. That depends on you. But if you choose to accept the offer fully, I will speak with your father this evening. We can have a formal announcement within the week. Society will follow the more interesting story. It always does. He said it without sentiment, clean and direct and practical. She had expected to find that cold. Instead, she found it steadying. She had had enough of sentiment today. What do you want in return? She asked. No one does this for nothing. Something crossed his face. Brief. Not offense. Something more layered. A genuine partnership, he said. Someone who will not pretend. I am very tired of pretending, Miss Summers. She looked at the flowers in her hands. The white roses were bruising at the edges from being held too long. She set them on the seat beside her. I will think about it, she said. Of course, he said. He turned and looked out the window and did not press her further. That small, quiet restraint was the first thing he did that surprised her in a way that had nothing to do with the drama of the morning. It was simply respect. She had not expected that. Not today. She looked at his profile as the city moved past and felt, underneath all the grief and anger and exhaustion, the first faint thread of a question forming. Not about her future, not about the arrangement, but about him specifically. Who are you, really? And somewhere beneath the wreckage of the worst morning of her life, she found she wanted to know. The Summers household was chaotic underneath a thin surface of control. Constance had already burned through 3 handkerchiefs and was on her 4th. Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, had responded to the crisis the way she responded to everything, by making large quantities of tea that nobody touched. Aurelia's father, Edmund, had paced the length of the sitting room 11 times since they arrived home, and her mother Margaret sat with her hands folded so tightly her rings had left marks on her fingers. Aurelia sat in the center of all of it, composed in the way that people are composed when the alternative is unthinkable, and waited. At 7 o'clock precisely, the Duke of Carver knocked on their front door. He had not sent a note ahead. He simply appeared, which was technically improper, and Edmund Summers answered the door himself, which was something he had not done for a visitor in over a decade. Something about the Duke seemed to rearrange the ordinary rules of things without anyone quite deciding to allow it. They sat in the drawing room, the slightly worn one with the curtains that had faded at the edges and the fireplace that always smoked a little on the left side. The Duke sat in the armchair and looked neither uncomfortable nor performatively comfortable. He simply occupied the space and spoke directly. You want to know why? He said to Edmund. And you want to know what my intentions are toward your daughter. Edmund, who had spent 30 years as a solicitor and had the permanent, professional suspicion to prove it, looked at him without softening. Those are the 2 things. The why is simple. What happened today was wrong, and I was in a position to act. I am not a man who looks away from injustice because acting is inconvenient. He paused. My intentions are serious and honorable. I am not offering charity. I am proposing a marriage with full respect for your daughter and full responsibility for everything that entails. Margaret's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Aurelia caught it and looked away, because, Her mother's hope was the most painful thing in this room, and she could not let it influence her. Edmund studied the Duke for a long, measuring moment. Then he said, "I would like to speak with my daughter privately." The Duke rose without hesitation or visible offence, and left the room. The door closed behind him, and Constance could be heard in the hallway, making a startled noise before retreating upstairs. Edmund looked at his daughter. The professional face came off completely. Underneath it was just her father, tired and aching. "How are you?" he asked. "I am managing." "That is not what I asked." Aurelia looked at her hands. "I am hurt and angry, but I am not broken. I need you to know that. Papa." He was quiet. Then, "What do you think of him?" "I think he is honest, or consistent enough in his honesty that the difference hardly matters on short acquaintance." He almost smiled. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go in there and set a condition," she said, "and see how he responds to it. That will tell me more than another hour of conversation." Her father looked at her for a moment, then walked to the door and called the Duke back. Caius stood near the fireplace and waited. "I have one condition," Aurelia said. "Name it." "I will not be decorative. I will not manage dinner parties, and smile and stay quiet. If I agree to this arrangement, I am a full partner. My opinions will exist and I will use them. If that inconveniences you, but I am the wrong woman." The silence was brief. "I did not ask the wrong woman," the Duke said. Her mother exhaled so softly it was almost inaudible. 3 days later the announcement was in the papers. Miss Aurelia Summers was to marry Caius Alderton, Duke of Carver, in 6 weeks. London absorbed this information with tremendous enthusiasm and very little restraint. Drawing rooms crackled with it. Luncheons ran long because nobody wanted to leave before they had fully dissected every angle. The story of the Duke who had stepped forward was consuming the story of the groom who had fled, exactly as Caius had predicted, because society would always chase the more astonishing narrative. A small gossip column, 3 days after the announcement, mentioned Lord Fenwick Drayle in connection with a gambling debt large enough to ruin him publicly, if not repaid before the month ended. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody needed to. The timing spoke with perfect clarity about exactly why he had walked away from the altar. Aurelia read it once. Then she set it down and turned her attention to the future, which was the only direction that held anything useful. She and Caius met formally 4 times in the following week, always with a chaperone. Usually her mother, or Lady Portia Alderton, the Duke's elderly aunt, who had introduced herself to Aurelia by studying her for 10 unblinking seconds and then declaring that she had good posture, which was a better beginning than most. Aurelia liked Lady Portia immediately and completely. Caius, in these formal settings, but was attentive without being excessive. He spoke when he had something to say, which was not always, and the silences between subjects were not awkward, but simply quiet, which Aurelia found she preferred enormously to men who talked in order to fill space rather than to communicate. She noticed other things. He almost never laughed, but occasionally a reluctant amusement crossed his face and disappeared quickly, as though it was surprised to find itself there. He paid attention to every room he entered with a focused, constant awareness that was not paranoid, but was very deliberate. And he watched her, not rudely, but with a particular, careful attention that made her feel she was being genuinely observed, not simply looked at. On the 5th day, her mother was called briefly from the sitting room by a household matter. And Lady Portia fell asleep in her chair with extraordinary speed, leaving Aurelia and Caius without a functioning chaperone for approximately 7 minutes. Neither of them remarked on it. Instead, Aurelia said, "Lady Portia told me about the school fees." Caius looked at her. "She told you that. And the widow and the carriage in the rain. And at least 2 other things I suspect you would prefer I did not know. She is supposed to be chaperoning, not narrating. She is doing both, very efficiently." Aurelia tilted her head slightly. "The man she described does not match the man I expected when I heard the words Duke of Carver. What did you expect? Someone colder, more self-interested." He held her gaze. "And now? Now I am not sure what I think, which is more interesting than being sure, or so I consider it an improvement." Something moved through his expression, something that came and went in a moment, but left a particular quality of stillness behind it. "You may be the most genuinely honest person I have met in years," he said. "You said something similar in the carriage." "I meant it then, too." The door opened, and her mother returned with apologies. Lady Portia surfaced from her chair with the instant alertness of someone who had not been asleep at all. The conversation redirected to appropriate subjects. But something had shifted, small and real, and Aurelia felt it sitting with her through the rest of the evening and into the night. She lay awake and let herself think about Fenwick, because she was not the kind of person who could avoid necessary pain by pretending it did not exist. She felt the anger of 3 years ending in a side door, and a man who had not looked back, and she let herself feel it fully, because unfelt things had a way of surfacing later, with more damage attached. Then she put it down, and thought instead about a man who had stood up in a crowded church and walked toward her when every social instinct in that building was telling everyone to stay seated, who had spoken to her father without arrogance or performance, who listened more than he spoke and said exactly what he meant when he did speak, and had, in 7 unchaperoned minutes, made her feel more genuinely seen than she had in 3 years, with a man she had intended to marry. She did not know what that meant yet. She was not ready to name it. But 2 streets away, in the house she had never entered, a light burned on the 2nd floor, long past the hour when sensible people slept. She could not have known that. She had no way of knowing it. Caius Alderton sat at his desk beside a window, and turned face down a small portrait that had stood on that desk long enough that he usually looked past it without seeing it. He was not entirely sure why he did it. He only knew that something had changed, and the portrait belonged to A, before that no longer felt current. He looked out at the quiet street. He thought about a woman who had stood completely alone at an altar in front of 200 people, and had not cried, and had not collapsed, and had asked him, with perfect directness and no performance at all, what he wanted in return. He thought about the flowers she had set on the carriage seat when she was done with them, and the Duke of Carver, who had not smiled easily in longer than he could accurately recall, found something very close to one, crossing his face in the dark and the quiet. He did not stop it. The wedding was not what anyone expected, not because it was small, though it was considerably smaller than the spectacle that had been planned for the Drayle Union. Not because it was rushed, though 6 weeks was fast enough to keep tongues moving in every parlour in London. It was unexpected because of the feeling inside the church. The last time Aurelia had stood at an altar, the air had been thick with the particular tension of a performance, everyone dressed and positioned, and waiting for a ceremony that was really more about appearances than anything else. This time the church was quieter. The guest list was a fraction of the previous one. Edmund Somers stood beside his daughter with a steadiness that came from genuine feeling rather than obligation. Margaret sat in the front pew beside Constance, who was gripping her mother's hand hard enough to be uncomfortable, and did not seem to care. Lady Portia sat directly behind them, upright and alert, wearing an expression that on another woman's face might have been called moved, though she would have denied it categorically. And then there were the Duke's people. His solicitor, Mr. Graves, a thin, precise man who had served the Alderton family for 20 years and looked at everything with the careful eyes of someone who had seen fortunes built and dismantled. His closest friend, Lord Bellamy Hurst, who was broad-shouldered and openly warm in a way that contrasted dramatically with the Duke and seemed completely comfortable with that contrast. Lord Hurst had shaken Aurelia's hand at the pre-wedding introduction and said, with obvious sincerity, that Caius had made a better decision in one impulsive moment than most men managed in a lifetime of deliberate ones. She liked him immediately. There was also Lady Hurst, Bellamy's wife Theodora, who had the bright, precise manner of a woman who noticed everything and catalogued it efficiently. She had taken one long look at Aurelia during the introduction, and then leaned slightly toward her husband and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "She will be absolutely fine." It had been meant as reassurance. It had also been clearly a verdict. Caius had arrived before her. He stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him with that particular focused attention she had come to recognize over the past 6 weeks. Not performance, not nerves, just presence. He was simply fully there, watching her come toward him, and something about that steady watching made the walk feel less like a march and more like a choice, which it was. She reminded herself of that. She had made this decision with clear eyes. She was keeping it with clear eyes. The ceremony was brief and genuine. The vows were the traditional ones, but Aurelia meant every syllable, and she could tell from the quality of his voice, low and certain, that he did too. When it was done, and they walked out together into the afternoon light, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than that. But something more like the feeling of a door closing properly, the clean, small sound of a latch finding its place. The reception was held at Carver House, which was the first time Aurelia had been inside it. She had expected grandeur because everything she knew about the Duke suggested it. She had not expected warmth, but Carver House had it, not in the obvious decorative way of houses that were trying to impress, but in a deeper way. The rooms were large, but the furniture was chosen for use rather than display. The walls held paintings that looked genuinely loved rather than acquired. The staff, who she met briefly and in rapid succession, had the particular ease of people who worked in a place where they were treated decently. She filed every observation quietly and said nothing. The reception moved with the specific energy of an event that was too interesting for anyone to be bored by. Lord Hurst told 3 separate stories about Caius that were each more revealing than Caius clearly wished them to be, and Caius bore this with the patient expression of a man who had long since accepted this as the cost of the friendship. Lady Portia circulated through the room with the controlled precision of a general surveying her territory. Constance, who had cried twice during the ceremony and once during the carriage ride over, was now on her 2nd glass of champagne and talking with Mr. Graves about legal reform with an intensity that appeared to be mutual. Edmund Summers stood near the window, with a glass he barely touched, and watched his daughter moving through the room. Aurelia crossed to him when she had a moment. "Or you look like you are calculating something," she said. "I am always calculating something," he said. "It is a professional hazard." He was quiet for a moment. "He watches you." "I know." "Not the way men usually watch women at events like this. Not as though you are something to be admired or managed. As though you are something he is genuinely trying to understand." Aurelia said nothing. I am not sure yet whether that is reassuring or concerning, her father said. But I noticed it. So do I, she said. Later, when the guests had thinned and the evening had settled into its quieter final hours, Caius found her standing near the library doorway. She had drifted there without fully intending to, pulled by the particular comfort that rooms full of books had always offered her. "You can go in," he said from behind her. She turned. He was closer than she had expected, close enough that she was aware of it specifically. "It feels presumptuous," she said. "It is your library." "It is your house now," he said, simply, without ceremony. She turned back to the shelves. They were extraordinary. Floor to ceiling, every wall, organized with a logic she could not immediately decode, but that clearly had one. "Did you read all of these?" she asked. "Not all. Perhaps 2/3. Which is your favorite?" He moved to stand beside her and looked at the shelves for a moment. Then he crossed to the far wall and came back with a book and handed it to her. It was old, the spine worn, soft. She looked at the title. It was a collection of letters, correspondence between two people over 20 years. "Letters," she said. "People are most honest in letters," he said. "Or they think they have time to construct something, but what they actually produce is themselves." She looked at him. "Is that why you are so careful with what you say in person?" Something moved through his expression. He was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps," he said. She held the book and thought about that, and about the particular quality of the evening, and about the fact that this was her wedding night in a house she had entered for the first time 3 hours ago. And the man she had married was standing close enough that she could see the fine detail of that scar above his left brow. "I want to ask you something," she said. "You generally do," he said. And there it was, that reluctant, almost smile, gone in a second, but genuinely present while it lasted. "The portrait you keep on your desk," she said. "Lady Portia mentioned it. She said you turned it face down the night of the announcement. She did not tell me who it was." The almost smile disappeared. The silence was different now, not the easy kind. "That," he said carefully, "is a conversation for another time." "All right," she said. She did not push. She had promised herself she would not push things before they were ready to be pushed, but she noticed that his jaw had tightened slightly, and his eyes had gone to the middle distance for just a moment before returning to her, and she filed that away with everything else she was learning about him, all the small details that were slowly assembling themselves into something that was beginning to feel like a person, rather than a title. She handed the book of letters back to him. "Keep it," he said. "Consider it a wedding gift." She looked down at it in her hands. "One book?" "The right one," he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that careful, focused attention, and something underneath it that she was getting better at detecting. Something that lived behind the steadiness and the control. Something that was not quite as composed as everything else about him. She did not name it. Not yet. "Thank you, Caius," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name directly to his face. He went very still for just a moment. Then he said, "You are welcome, Aurelia." And the way he said her name, like he had been turning it over for weeks and was finally allowing himself to use it, did something small and irreversible to the carefully maintained distance she had been keeping between observation and feeling. Or she looked back at the shelves. They stood together in the library doorway for a little while longer, not talking, and the silence was not empty, but full, the way silence is full when two people are both thinking hard about the same thing, and neither of them is ready yet to say what it is. A marriage conducted in public and lived in private are two entirely different things. Aurelia understood this within the first week. The public version was clean and legible. The Duke and his new Duchess attended 2 dinners, one at the Hurst residence and one at a gathering hosted by a countess whose name Aurelia had known for years, and whose house she had never previously been invited to enter. She wore the Alderton emeralds at both, which were extraordinary pieces that Lady Portia had produced from somewhere, with the satisfied expression of a woman reinstating a tradition. Society watched the new Duchess of Carver with the combined intensity of people who had seen the beginning of this story and were desperate to see what the middle would bring. Aurelia gave them nothing they could use. She was gracious, engaged, and completely opaque about anything that mattered, which she had learned from her father and which served her beautifully. The private version was more complicated. Carver House was large enough that 2 people could move through it all day without crossing paths, unless they intended to. In the first week, this happened more than she liked. Not because of hostility. There was no hostility. But there was a careful navigation happening on both sides. To 2 people who had agreed to share a life, trying to establish where the edges of that life were, and what could be touched, and what could not yet be approached. They breakfasted together every morning, which had apparently been Caius's suggestion to his housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, before the wedding. This Aurelia found out from Constance, who had become inexplicably connected to the Carver House staff pipeline within 2 weeks of the marriage, through what Aurelia could only describe as her sister's supernatural social permeability. Breakfast was where she learned the most about him. He read the morning papers with a focus that was total and silent for the first 15 minutes, and she learned quickly not to interrupt this because it was not rudeness but something closer to necessity. After the papers he was more present, more talkative in his particular way, which meant he asked her questions rather than filling the space with his own observations. He asked her what she had been reading, what she thought about the reform bill currently moving through Parliament, whether she found Mrs. Calloway satisfactory or would prefer changes made. He asked her things, real questions, and he listened to the answers with the same focused attention he gave everything else. She found this extraordinary because, in her entire experience of men in social settings, she had encountered very few who asked questions and meant them. On the 9th day of their marriage, something happened that changed the temperature of things. Aurelia had been in the east sitting room, writing letters to her mother and Constance, when she heard raised voices from the direction of Caius's study. And this was remarkable because Carver House operated at a consistent low volume, and raised voices were not part of its vocabulary. She did not intend to listen. She passed the study door on her way to the main staircase, and the voice behind it was not Caius's, but someone else's. A man's voice she did not recognize, sharp and demanding, with a particular entitlement woven through it that made her slow her pace involuntarily. Then she heard Caius's voice, low and controlled and utterly immovable. "You were told the terms when the loan was structured, Harwick. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," the other voice said. "Your circumstances have changed considerably. A new wife, a new public profile. You can afford generosity." "I can afford generosity," Caius said, with a calm that was more intimidating than volume. "That is not what you are asking for." A pause. Then the unknown voice, harder now. "Your father made promises. My father made many promises. I am not my father." The silence that followed that sentence had weight in it. Aurelia moved on from the door before she heard anything else, but those words stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. "I am not my father," the way he had said it. Not angry, exactly, but with the particular flatness of a sentence that had been said so many times internally that saying it aloud had become reflexive and necessary. She thought about the portrait on his desk, the one turned face down. She thought about the careful way he inhabited his own house, not as someone completely at home in it, but as someone who had made a deliberate decision about how to occupy a space that had not always felt like his. As that evening at dinner, she waited until the servants had cleared the second course, and they were alone with their wine and the comfortable quiet that dinners between them had started to develop, and she said, "Who is Harwick?" Caius looked up from his glass. "I was not listening intentionally," she said. "I passed the door." He held her gaze for a moment. His expression did not close the way she had half expected it to. Instead, something shifted, a small, deliberate opening, like a window moved an inch. "An associate of my father's," he said. Men who believed the Alderton name was a resource they could draw on indefinitely. "There are several of them." "And your father," she said carefully. "Is he gone?" 4 years ago. He turned his wine glass slightly on the table. He was not a man who managed his responsibilities carefully, and I have spent most of my adult life correcting the results of that. She was quiet for a moment. "The portrait," she said. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, complicated and old. "His," he said. Simply. One word. She understood now, the turning of it face down on the night of the announcement. Not grief. Something more tangled and honest than grief. "I am sorry," she said. Not for the death, for the kind of father he had clearly been. "Do not be," he said. "It made me careful. Careful is useful." "Careful can also be lonely," she said. He went very still. She had not planned to say it. It had arrived from somewhere genuine and left her mouth before she could evaluate it. And now it was in the room between them, and she could not take it back and was not sure she wanted to. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was not tight, the way it had been the night of the wedding when she had asked about the portrait. His expression was something else, open in a way she had not seen from him before, unguarded in a way that felt almost accidental. "Yes," he said quietly. "It can be." She held that moment carefully, the way you hold something that might be delicate without being entirely sure. And then she picked up her wine glass and moved the conversation forward to something lighter, because she had learned from him that restraint had its own value, and she did not want to take more of him than he had offered. But later that night, in the adjoining room that connected to his through a door they had not yet opened, she lay awake and thought about what it meant that the most controlled man she had ever met had just answered her honestly about loneliness without any apparent attempt to deflect it. She thought about what Lord Hurst had said at the wedding reception, how he had pulled her aside while Caius was occupied with another guest, and said, quietly and with evident sincerity, "He has not laughed easily since he was perhaps 22. I want you to know that. Not to pressure you, just so you understand what you have actually changed by being here." She had not known what to do with that then. She was still not entirely sure what to do with it now. What she knew was that she was no longer simply observing him from a careful distance and cataloguing details. Something had moved. She was invested, genuinely and increasingly, out in understanding him and in what was building between them, slowly and without performance, in the mornings over newspapers and the evenings over dinner, and the 7 minutes unchaperoned when she had told him she found uncertainty more interesting than certainty. She was also aware that somewhere in London, Fenwick Drayle was dealing with the consequences of what he had done, and she felt almost nothing about that except a clean and final relief that she was here instead of there. And then there was the letter. It arrived on the 11th morning, addressed to the Duchess of Carver, which still stopped her for a half-second when she saw it, because it was her name now, and her mind had not entirely accepted that. She opened it at the breakfast table before Caius arrived, which was unusual because he was generally punctual, but the handwriting was not familiar. The signature at the bottom was Fenwick Drayle. She read it once. Then she set it face down on the table beside her coffee cup and sat very still for a moment. Caius arrived 2 minutes later. He noticed immediately. He noticed everything. He sat down and looked at the letter and then at her face. "Do you want to tell me?" he asked. She turned the letter over and slid it across the table to him. He read it. His expression did not change visibly, but something in his stillness intensified, the way water looks still on the surface when there is a great deal of movement below. He set it down. "He wants to explain," Aurelia said. Her voice was steady. "He says he had no choice. He says the debt would have destroyed both families, and he panicked. He is asking for a private conversation." Caius said nothing. "I am not going to meet him," she said. "I want to be clear about that. But I thought you should know it arrived." He looked at her. "You do not owe me an account of your correspondence." "I know," she said. "I showed you because I wanted to. Not because I felt I had to." He held her gaze. That openness from the night before was still there, slightly, like something that had been permitted to remain. "All right," he said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his paper. The morning continued, but Caius did not read the paper that morning with the focused totality he usually brought to it. His eyes moved across the lines with less certainty than usual, and twice he turned a page and then turned it back. Aurelia noticed. She said nothing. She simply sat across the table from her husband of 11 days and drank her coffee and understood, with a clarity that felt like something arriving rather than something decided, that she was beginning to care about him in a way that was no longer theoretical. And that realization was both the most frightening and the most alive she had felt since before a messenger had walked down a church aisle and destroyed what she had thought was her future. She thought, perhaps it was not destroyed. Perhaps it was simply replaced with something real. The letter from Fenwick was not the last disruption that month. 3 days after it arrived, Lady Portia appeared at Carver House at 10:30 in the morning without sending word ahead, which was her established method of arrival, and which the staff had clearly learned to accommodate without visible alarm. She came into the morning room, where Aurelia was working through the household accounts, and sat down with the directness of someone who had not come for pleasantries, and said, "There is something you need to know before you hear it from someone less reliable." Aurelia set down her pen. "Tell me." "Fenwick Drayle has been speaking. Quietly, in the clubs, in the places where men say things they believe will not reach women. He is suggesting that the marriage was engineered, that Caius had prior knowledge of the debt and used it to position himself." Aurelia was very still. "He is saying Caius arranged for him to walk away. He is implying it with enough care that he cannot be directly accused of saying it, which is the most cowardly form of slander available." Lady Portia's expression was magnificently contemptuous. "The story is reaching drawing rooms. Slowly, but it is moving." "Does Caius know?" "He knows. Or he has known for 2 days. He chose not to tell you, which I consider a mistake, which is why I am here." Aurelia absorbed this. The first feeling was not anger at Caius for not telling her. The first feeling was something colder and more focused, directed entirely at Fenwick, who had not only walked away from her publicly, but was now using his cowardice as material to damage the man who had stepped forward. The second feeling, arriving close behind the first, was something that surprised her with its intensity. It was protectiveness. Of Caius. Of his name and his reputation, and the carefully built life he had spent years constructing from the wreckage his father had left him. She stood up. "Where is he?" she asked Lady Portia. "In his study. He has been there since early morning." "Mr. de Graves arrived an hour ago." Aurelia walked to the study and knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Caius looked up from the desk. Mr. Graves, seated opposite him, turned with the carefully neutral expression of a man trained to react to nothing. "Give us a moment, please," Aurelia said to Mr. Graves. He looked at Caius. Caius gave a slight nod. Mr. Graves gathered his papers and left, closing the door behind him with the quiet precision of someone who understood he had just been moved out of a room by a duchess and found no fault with it. Aurelia looked at her husband. "You should have told me," she said. "I was managing it," he said. "I am sure you were." "That is not what I said." She came further into the room and sat in the chair Mr. Graves had vacated and looked at him directly. "We are partners. Or you said so before we were married. I said so before I agreed. A partner does not manage things away from me to protect me. A partner tells me what is happening, and we manage it together." He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted, not defensively, but genuinely, the look of a man encountering a fair argument. "You are right," he said, simply and without qualification. She had expected more resistance. The lack of it disarmed her slightly. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. Fenwick's debt was older than Aurelia had known, accumulated over 4 years through a combination of poor investments and a gambling habit that had been carefully concealed from everyone, including her. The creditor had set a final date 3 weeks before the wedding. Fenwick had attempted to find alternate solutions, and found none. Walking away had been, in his own calculating assessment, the least damaging option available to him personally, with no consideration given to what it would cost Aurelia. The slander now circulating was, in Caius's precise assessment, the action of a man who needed someone else to carry the weight of his own disgrace. "He cannot prove anything," Caius said, "because there is nothing to prove. I had no prior knowledge of his debt. I acted in the moment because it was the right thing to do." "I know that," Aurelia said. "Society may not." "Then we give society something clearer to look at." She thought for a moment. "The Whitmore Spring gathering is in 10 days. Everyone will be there. We attend together, visibly and without any suggestion of strain. And we are so clearly and genuinely what we are that the story Fenwick is circulating has no surface to attach itself to." Caius looked at her. "You make it sound simple." "It is not simple. It is deliberate. There is a difference." She met his eyes. "Unless you have a reason to believe we cannot appear genuinely united." The question was underneath those words, and they both heard it. He looked at her for a long moment, with those dark, careful eyes, and then he said, "I have no such reason." Something in the room changed, not dramatically, quietly, the way rooms change when something that has been approaching for some time finally arrives. "Good," she said. "Then we go." The 10 days between that conversation and the Whitmore gathering were the most honest days of their marriage so far. Something had shifted after the study. The careful navigation that had defined the early weeks was still present, but its quality had changed. There was less distance in it now, and more of what she could only describe as genuine proximity, 2 people moving in the same direction rather than parallel ones. They walked in the garden in the evenings, which had apparently been nobody's habit before, and became theirs without either of them deciding it. He told her things during those walks. Not everything, not all at once, but consistently more than before. He told her about the years after his father's death, the scale of what he had inherited, and what that word actually meant when most of what you inherit is damage. He told her about Lord Hurst, who had been his closest friend since they were 17, and who had once, but in a moment of financial crisis Caius had been too proud to discuss, deposited a sum of money into his account with no note attached, and never mentioned it. He told her that the only time he had come close to marrying before was 8 years ago, a woman he had genuinely admired who had chosen someone with a cleaner legacy and a simpler life, and that he had understood her reasoning and not blamed her for it, which was perhaps the saddest kind of acceptance. Aurelia listened to all of it and gave him things in return. Things she had not spoken about often. The specific texture of growing up in a household that was always just slightly stretched between what it was and what it needed to appear to be. Of the way she had learned to read rooms and people from a very young age, because knowing what a room needed from you was the safest way to move through it. The 3 years with Fenwick, and what they had actually been. Not a passionate love, but a careful, hopeful investment in a stable future, which made his leaving both a heartbreak and a particular kind of insult, because he had known what she was investing, and he had taken it anyway. "You are not what I expected," Caius said on one of those evenings. "You have said something like that before," she said. "I mean it differently now," he said. "Before I meant your honesty. Now I mean all of it." He paused. "I mean you specifically." She looked at him in the evening light, the garden quiet around them, the city present but distant, and she felt the full weight of what was building between them, not the arrangement they had agreed to in a drawing room with her father watching, but something that had been growing underneath that arrangement this entire time, fed by breakfasts and conversations and 7 unchaperoned minutes, and the study and these walks. She was in love with him. She did not say it. The timing was not right, and she was not yet certain enough of his equivalent feeling to say it without knowing what she would find on the other side of it. But she knew it, with the same clean, clear certainty with which she had known, standing at that first altar, that the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. This was different. This was solid ground. She was sure of that. The night before the Whitmore gathering, Constance came to dinner. This had become a regular occurrence. Constance had developed what could only be described as a deep personal investment in the Carver household, and Caius bore her energetic presence with a patience that Aurelia had come to recognize as genuine fondness rather than tolerance. He had given Constance access to the library, which had been an act of such precise understanding of what her sister needed that Aurelia had stood in the hallway afterward and pressed her hand briefly to her own chest. At dinner, Constance said, without any preamble, "I saw Fenwick Drayle at a shop this afternoon." The table went quiet. "He looked terrible," Constance continued, with the unfiltered honesty that had always been both her most endearing and most alarming quality. "And he saw me, and he looked away very fast, which tells you everything." Caius said nothing, but something in his jaw moved once. "What did you do?" Aurelia asked her sister. "I looked directly at him for 5 full seconds, and then I walked away," Constance said, which I thought was the correct amount of acknowledgement for someone who does not deserve any. Aurelia looked across the table at her husband. He was looking back at her. There was something in his expression she had not seen before, something warm and specific present in his eyes without any attempt to conceal it. It lasted only a moment. Then it settled back into its usual steadiness. But she had seen it. She carried it with her into the next day. The Whitmore gathering was everything London society produced when it was fully assembled and at its best performance. The house was extraordinary, the rooms full, to the air thick with the specific combination of perfume and ambition and carefully managed conversation that defined the season at its height. Aurelia had been to gatherings of this scale before, always as a guest of moderate standing, always aware of the invisible tier system that organized who spoke to whom and for how long. She entered on Caius's arm as the Duchess of Carver, and the difference was immediate and total, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the difference mattered. What she had not expected was that it would feel secondary to something else entirely. She had expected to feel the weight of the evening's purpose, the calculated visibility, the need to appear exactly right. Instead, she was aware, predominantly and almost exclusively, of the man beside her. The steadiness of his arm, or the way he positioned himself slightly between her and the densest concentrations of people without making it obvious. The way he introduced her, not as his Duchess, a title, a possession, but as Aurelia, with a quality in his voice that anyone paying attention would have recognized as something beyond formality. Lord Hurst found them within the first 20 minutes, and shook Caius's hand, and kissed Aurelia's, and said, loudly enough for the surrounding cluster of guests to hear, "You two are the best thing to happen to this season, and I will fight anyone who disagrees." Lady Theodora Hurst, arriving at her husband's elbow, said more quietly to Aurelia, "He has been saying that to everyone for a week. It is working." Aurelia laughed. A real one. Unplanned. Caius turned to look at her when she laughed, or the way people turn toward something they find unexpected and want to see more clearly, and she caught him looking and did not look away. Neither did he. It was perhaps 4 seconds. In a room full of people it was nothing. It was also, she thought, everything. Fenwick Drayle was present at the gathering. She saw him across the room in the second hour, standing in a group that seemed slightly too loud and slightly too deliberate, the way groups look when the person at the center of them needs them to appear normal. He looked across the room at some point and found her, and she was standing with Caius and the Hursts and Lady Portia and her father, who had been invited and had come with the quiet, upright dignity of a man who intended to be visibly present tonight, and Fenwick Drayle looked at that group and looked away. He left the gathering an hour later. Aurelia knew because Lady Portia informed her with the brisk satisfaction of a general reporting a retreat. She felt a nothing, less than nothing. A clean, empty space where pain had briefly been. They left the Whitmore gathering late, when the rooms had thinned and the candles had burned lower, and the remaining guests were the ones who had nowhere urgent to be or nothing pressing to return to. The carriage ride home was quiet, a good quiet, the kind that follows an evening that has gone exactly as it needed to, and left everyone in it slightly lighter than before. Aurelia watched the city passing outside the window and felt the warmth of the evening sitting in her chest, the laughter and the Hursts and her father's steady presence, and Caius's arm and those 4 seconds when they had looked at each other, and neither of them had looked away. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he agreed, though I think Lord Hurst's contribution was not insignificant. Lord Hurst's contribution to most things is not insignificant. He has a gift for being loud at exactly the right moment. She smiled at the window. "You are lucky to have him." "I know," Caius said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of any deflection or minimizing, was so characteristic of him at his most genuine that she felt it land warmly. She turned from the window. He was watching her. He did not look away when she caught him, which was different from before. Before, he had always given her a moment of that careful looking and then redirected. Tonight, he held her gaze. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am thinking that I owe you an honest conversation that I have been postponing." She waited. "When I stood up in that church," he said slowly, "I told you afterward that I hadn't planned it. That was true, but there was something I didn't tell you, something that I was not prepared to examine honestly at the time." She was very still. "I had been watching you for longer than 2 meetings," he said, not in a manner I had named to myself, but I was aware of you in a way I had not permitted myself to examine because your situation was what it was, and I had no right to anything. She absorbed this. "How long?" "Since the winter gathering 14 months ago, when your friend pointed me out to you across the room, and you glanced at me once, and then looked away, without any of the performance most people produce when they realize they are being observed." She remembered that moment. She had not known anyone was watching her look at him. "You looked away," he said, "because you were not interested in impressing me. And I thought, from across a crowded room, that was the most interesting person I had seen in years." Aurelia felt something moving in her chest, large and warm and no longer deniable. "And then the spring luncheon," he said. "When you said you had been surprised that I read the book twice, I caught your surprise and you did not try to conceal it. You simply let me see that you had assumed something about me and been wrong. No recovery, no social smoothing. Just honesty." He paused. "I thought about that for weeks." "Caius," she said. "I am not telling you this to pressure you into something," he said, and his voice had the particular careful quality of a man being extremely precise, because precision was the only way he knew to handle things that mattered enormously. "I am telling you because you have given me honesty from the first moment, and you deserve the same in return. What I felt in that church when I stood up was not only chivalry, it was not only a strategy, it was the one opportunity I could see to change something I had decided I had no right to want." The carriage moved through the quiet streets. Aurelia looked at him, at this man who had turned a portrait face down on the night he had decided to step forward, who had raised a boy's school fees without telling anyone, who stood in rain rather than leave a widow stranded, who had asked her real questions and listened to real answers and been honestly lonely in a house full of things he had repaired at great personal cost. And she felt the full weight of what she had been carrying for weeks finally find its proper name. "I am in love with you," she said. No preamble, no softening, just the truth, exactly as it was. He went completely still, not the controlled stillness she had come to know as his default. Something different. The stillness of a man who has just heard something he had not allowed himself to expect, and does not yet entirely know what to do with it. "Aurelia," he said. "I am not telling you because you told me," she said. "I am telling you because it is true, and I decided in a church several months ago that I was done arranging my truth around what was convenient." Something happened to his face, something she had never seen before. Not the reluctant, almost smile. Something complete and unguarded and entirely real, a softening of everything he usually held carefully in place, and underneath it was a feeling so obvious and so long contained that she wondered how she had ever needed him to say it. He reached across the small space of the carriage and took her hand. Not a formal gesture, not a polite one, a real one. "I have been in love with you," he said quietly. since you set those flowers down on the seat beside you and looked at me and asked what I wanted in return. Because that was the moment I understood that you were not going to be grateful or overwhelmed or perform any of the things the situation seemed to call for. You were simply going to be exactly yourself, regardless of what that cost you. She looked at their joined hands. His was warm, completely steady. She looked up at him. We have been rather slow about this. We have been rather careful about this, he said. There is a difference. You sound like me. You have been an influence. She laughed again, that real, unplanned one from the gathering, and he watched it the same way he had watched it then, like something that needed to be seen clearly. The carriage stopped. They were home. He helped her out, and they went inside together, past the staff offering quiet good evenings, or through the house that was hers now, in a way that felt completely true, to the library doorway where they had stood on their wedding night with a book of letters and a silence full of things not yet ready to be said. She stopped there. So did he. The door, she said, looking not at the library but at the one beside it, the connecting door between their rooms that had been closed for the 6 weeks of their marriage. He looked at her. I think, she said carefully, that it has been closed long enough. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his eyes was entirely open. No calculation, no management, no careful assembly of the right expression. Just him. I think so too, he said. She reached up and touched the scar above his left brow, lightly, of the way you touch something you have wondered about for a long time and finally have permission to understand. He went still under her hand, but not in the tense way, in the way of someone allowing something. How did you get it? She asked. Fell from a horse at 16, he said, trying to impress someone who was not watching. Were they watching? No. Their loss, she said. He caught her hand as she lowered it from his face, held it the way he had in the carriage, real and warm and entirely without performance. I want to tell you something, he said, that I should have said sooner but did not know how to say, without it sounding like something I had constructed. Tell me now. You changed this house, he said. Not the furniture or the rooms, the quality of being inside it. I did not know it was possible for a place to feel different because a specific person was in it. I know that now. She felt those words move through her, quiet and deep, the way water moves through stone. Not dramatic, permanent. Caius, she said. Yes. Stop talking. He looked at her for one more moment, that open, unguarded look, and then he did what she had asked, and the library doorway held them, and the house was quiet around them, and the city moved through its indifferent nighttime business outside, and none of it mattered at all. Later, much later, when the house had settled fully into the small hours and the candles had burned low, Aurelia lay awake in a way that was entirely different from every other night she had lain awake in this room. Not with questions, not with careful observations to file and examine, not with the particular exhausting alertness of a person still trying to understand where she had landed, with something simple and warm and entirely at rest. Beside her, Caius slept with the specific quality of a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the morning a messenger had walked down a church aisle, and a man had walked away from her. And she had believed, in that first crushing moment, that what was collapsing was her future. She understood now that what had actually collapsed was the version of her future that was never going to be enough. What had replaced it was here, real and warm and honest and chosen, not fallen into, not performed, Not arranged for the sake of anyone's comfort, including her own. Chosen, clearly and deliberately, at one real conversation at a time. Fenwick Drayle was somewhere in the city, living with the consequences of the worst decision of his life. She felt, examining that fact one final time, almost nothing. Certainly no grief. Perhaps something very faint and distant that was adjacent to pity, because he had possessed something real and mistaken it for a liability, and walked away from it through a side door. That was not her problem. It would never be her problem again. Downstairs in the study, the portrait stayed face down on the desk. It would remain that way. 3 weeks later, Aurelia wrote a letter to her mother. In it, she said that she was well, that the house was beginning to feel entirely like home, that Caius had taken her to a lecture on natural history that had been extraordinary, though that Lady Portia had decided to spend more time at Carver House, which Aurelia considered excellent news, that Constance had been formally offered use of the library, and had essentially moved in as a consequence, and that she was happy. She paused over that last word for a moment, examined it, found it accurate. Happy. Not the careful, managed, hopeful happiness she had been aiming for through 3 years with a man who turned out to be aiming for an exit. Something sturdier, something with roots. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing post and went to find her husband, who was in the garden because it was their time for walking, and neither of them had needed to say so this morning. They had simply both arrived there. He was standing near the far hedge, looking at something, and she crossed the garden toward him. And when he heard her step on the path, he turned and looked at her, and the look on his face was the one she was still getting used to, the open one, the unguarded one, the one that had been underneath everything all along, waiting for someone to make it safe to exist. She reached him. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked. The city moved around the walls of the garden, noisy and indifferent and full of its ordinary business, and inside those walls everything was quiet and warm and entirely, completely theirs. In the church where it had all begun, the flowers from a different wedding had long since been cleared away. The candles along the altar had been replaced and lit for other ceremonies, other promises, other people standing at the edge of the rest of their lives. But in the register of marriages, kept behind the vestry door, where 2 names were recorded in the neat, permanent hand of the officiating clergyman, with a date and a witness signature below. Caius Alderton, Duke of Carver, Aurelia Summers, now Alderton. And beneath the formal language and the careful record-keeping, beneath all the propriety and procedure that society wrapped around even its most extraordinary moments, was the simple, true shape of what had actually happened. A man had stood up when it would have been easier to stay seated. A woman had said yes when she could have said nothing. And 2 people who had each spent years surrounded by things that looked like the real thing but had not, somehow, improbably and entirely without planning, found the real thing instead. That was enough. That was everything. If this story moved you the way it moved us in the making of it, if you found yourself rooting for Aurelia from the moment she lifted her chin at that altar, or holding your breath every time Caius finally let his guard down, then this community is exactly where you belong. Drop a comment and tell us, was there a moment in this story where you knew these 2 were meant for each other? We want to know your exact moment. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do it now, because the next story is already coming, and you do not want to be the last one to find it.